thank you so much for that introduction. Again, I won't repeat my thank yous because I think most of you were here for the earlier session. Yes, okay. So again, it's just a delight to be here. I'm a little intimidated at being the first speaker, and especially intimidated because the speaker after me is no one other than Shashi Tharoor, who is, I'm telling you, he is the best public speaker I've ever listened to. He is phenomenal. So you have to think of me as a warm-up act for Shashi. I titled my talk today as Writing as a Form of Self-Discovery, because in many ways, it really has been true for me. I'm very much an accidental writer. I never set out to be a writer. I achieved the pinnacle of my ambition when I became a physician in 1980 at Madras Medical College. That was really the goal. And so everything that has happened after that has been gravy. But I propose to sort of tell you a little bit about how that all came about and some of the lessons learned along the way. And I hope to stop in plenty of time for your questions and comments. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay, great. So I should mention, because this is significant, I was born in Ethiopia. Both my older brother George and I were born in Ethiopia because my parents were teachers in Ethiopia. They had both graduated about the time of Indian independence with physics degrees from Kerala. There were no jobs to be had, and so they both independently answered an ad for a teaching position in Ethiopia, and they both went. I mean, I still marvel at my mother, a single woman in a sari, you know, going on a steamship to Aden, and God knows how she made it to Addis Ababa. But because they changed their geography, it changed their destiny. And in many ways, because my brother and I were born in Ethiopia, our destiny was completely different from theirs. And then yet again, when I came and changed my geography again to be in Madras, in Chennai, my destiny was altered in another direction. So I'm a big believer in the function of geography in changing your destiny. My brother George, since he's here, I'll take the opportunity to tease him a little bit. He's older than me by 2 years, and the cross I had to bear all through my schooling was he would get perfect grades, and then 2 years later, I would arrive in the same class. And I had no special ability academically in anything, especially in math, which was a real disappointment, I imagine, to my two physics-trained parents. Whereas my brother, who went on to join IIT and is now a professor at MIT, was, you know, the model for how one should be. The only thing I would say that I had going for me is that I love to read. I love to read. It was a form of escape for me. And I should especially give a shout out to the US consular officer who's here to tell you how special the US consulate and the BBC reading rooms, the British Council reading rooms, were in my life in Addis Ababa. All of us made it a point to go there, check out books. One of my childhood friends from Ethiopia is here. I neglected to mention her, Amu, and I'm sure you remember those libraries that we used to go and check out. I remember I was 10 years old when I discovered Lady Chatterley's Lover. And at that moment, my reading took a very distinct change in trajectory, in direction. And I picked up the book that was to change my life, Of Human Bondage by Somerset Maugham. I'm embarrassed to tell you that I picked it up because the title suggested something very titillating was about to follow. But to my amazement, not my disappointment, the book turned out to be much more profound than anything I could have imagined. It's sort of an older book. Not everybody is as familiar with it. I think it still reads well. How many of you are familiar with the book? It's an amazing show of hands. I can tell you we wouldn't have that many hands up in America. That's great. But for those of you who don't know the book well, it begins with a young protagonist, Philip, and on page 1 you discover that he's being brought to his mother's deathbed She's about to die, and she dies by page 2. And you also discover that there's no father in the picture, and he has a club foot. He has a deformity of his foot. And so, this is the most miserable start to a novel. And he's raised by very strict parents, foster parents who are related to him, a preacher and his wife. He's bullied in school, and the only escape he has from this childhood of his is he loves to draw, he loves to paint. And so as soon as he comes of age, he escapes to Paris to become an artist against his foster parents' wishes. And when he gets there, it's very exciting. He's living in the French Quarter, he's taking lessons with a Monsieur Funier, and he's just living the life. But after about 9 months or so, he begins to get a little disillusioned. And one day he's standing outside his apartment, freezing, hungry, and he sees his professor go by, Monsieur Funier, and he stops him on an impulse. He stops him and says, "Would you please come up and take a look at my paintings and tell me if I have what it takes to go on?" And Monsieur Funier, you sense, is not the kind of person who likes to do this kind of thing, but he feels sorry for him and he goes up. And the reason, by the way, Philip is hungry and cold is he's standing out there avoiding the landlady who wants the rent. He's already sold his coat and he has no money for food. So it's a really desperate situation. So Monsieur Funier looks at all the paintings and finally says, "Is there something else you could be doing?" Essentially. And you can imagine how crushing this is for Philip, and yet this is what he wanted to know. He didn't really want to waste his life doing this if he didn't have the talent. And Monsieur Funier goes on to say something very interesting. He says, "Don't take this badly. I wish someone had told me what I'm telling you, because there is nothing worse for the temper than discovering one's own mediocrity at an advanced age." Great line, I thought. And so Philip, with his tail between his legs, goes back to London, where there's a small annuity left for him to pursue something professionally. And he decides to become a physician, which, in the light of his own disability, makes sense. And the first 2 years of medical school are sheer drudgery, as I'm sure my classmates will agree. This remained the same, sheer drudgery. But then he enters the clinical years. And Somerset Maugham describes that moment that Philip first sees patients and starts to round on the wards. And he says, "Philip saw humanity there in the rough, the artist's canvas. And he said to himself, 'This is something I can be good at.'" And ladies and gentlemen, those words just spoke to me. It was almost like a bolt of lightning. There I was in a room quietly reading this book, which had defied all my expectations, and I came to this line, and it just leapt out at me. It suggested to me that not everybody could be a brilliant mathematician like my older brother, but anybody with a curiosity about the human condition, a willingness to work hard, could be a physician. And that in doing that, you would find a kind of fulfillment and you would be providing a good service. And that was my calling to medicine. To tell you just how important books are in steering the course of your life. As it turns out, it wasn't very unusual with physicians of my era for a book to call you to medicine. In the Commonwealth in India, the book was often A.J. Cronin's The Citadel, describing conditions in a small Welsh mining town. In America, the book that called people was something called Arrowsmith by Sinclair Lewis. But it doesn't really matter. Of Human Bondage has very little medicine in it, but that one line spoke to me. And I think that's the magic of reader and writer, a very individual reader bringing their own take to a work. I believe it was Proust who said in his book, one of his books, that the book reads the soul of the reader. The book is reading the reader, The book is diagnosing us essentially and helping us to come to terms with where we're headed, what we're supposed to be doing. And so I embarked on medicine with the sense that this was going to be a grand romantic pursuit. I loved every moment of it. I had the most wonderful training at Madras Medical College. We all did. I was a disciple of K.V. Thiruvengadam, who was one of the most fantastic teachers of internal medicine I ever had. And I find myself 30 years later at the bedside still using the actual phrases that Thiruvengadam used for us. And here I am reciting them again, passing that legacy along, with no intention of becoming a writer. In the mid-'80s, I had just finished my internal medicine training, and I went to Boston to specialize in infectious diseases, just as this new disease was making itself known in America. And it was primarily affecting gay men and blood transfusion recipients. And it manifested by the most bizarre infections, pneumocystis and cryptococcal meningitis. And basically, this was the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which itself was a cumbersome word to explain something we didn't know what it was caused by. And I remember the excitement and the fear of that era. And towards the end of my training in Boston, 1985, it was announced that the cause for this mysterious illness had been discovered. It was a retrovirus. And all of us felt, well, now the cure is going to be around the corner. Instead of which, as soon as a blood test was discovered to be able to test for the virus, it became apparent that for every one person in the hospital with AIDS, there were perhaps 100, 150 people out there in the community, completely asymptomatic, carrying the virus. And everything we knew suggested that they would have the same downhill course that we'd been seeing in our hospitalized patients. But I was leaving Boston. I was leaving for a small town in Tennessee, a new medical school, Johnson City, population 50,000. And all the experts said that I could expect to see one HIV-infected patient every other year, maybe. Because AIDS was considered an urban phenomenon, not something that you would see in a small town in Tennessee. And certainly initially that was true, but very soon I began to see my first patient. It became a monthly event, it became a weekly event, and in a fairly short time, I had accumulated 100 people with HIV infection in this small town, 100-fold more than anyone predicted. And the mystery of why that town should have so much HIV turned out to be not that big a mystery after all. It wasn't that the town was a hotbed of sexual duplicity and sexual intrigue, which it was, by the way, but that wasn't the explanation. It turned out that I had stumbled onto an elaborate phenomenon of migration. And it goes like this. A young man grows up in a small town and leaves for all the same reasons you and I leave small towns: jobs, education, opportunity. But in their case, they were leaving because they were gay and did not want to live that lifestyle under the close scrutiny of their friends and relatives. And so they made their way to the big city, made their escape, found themselves, but tragically at some point, sometimes decades later, the virus had found them. And typically, they had cared for their partners who were ill, and now the partner had died, they were ill, they were now coming back to their small towns. And there I was at the tail end of this paradigm of migration, seeing many more infected patients than anyone expected me to see. I remember the moment, the eerie moment when I sort of saw this whole thing. I was at the deathbed of a young man who I had cared for, and he embodied the paradigm. He had grown up in that town. His father was a preacher. And when he was 7, he remembered walking through the schoolyard and his older brother, who was 9, turning to him and saying, "Must you walk that way?" And it turned out to be one of many differences that were pointed out to him, so much so that he felt as though he were an alien in that town. And so, as soon as he came of age, he made his brave escape, went to the Navy actually, and once he finished his term, settled in San Francisco, had the life that he dreamed about, but then his partner died, he got ill, and there he was, my patient. And he got progressively worse. There was very little I could do for him. This was a time before we had any medication for HIV. We could treat the infections that they got secondarily, but not the HIV. And a few days before he died, he called me up and he said, when I die, I don't want an autopsy, but if you like, you can come to my house and get some biopsies of my organs after I die. And I think he knew that I had a hard time getting any pathologist to do an autopsy, and yet, especially in his case, because he had this raging fever that I thought might be a lymphoma, he knew that I wanted to know. And so I promised him I would, and I went to his house, and I remember walking into the house, and his parents were weeping on the sofa, and his father rose up and said, "Praise the Lord, doctor, he's out of his misery." And then I went into his room, and I suddenly realized this was his childhood room. And on the walls were all these pictures from his childhood, a picture of Christ at Gethsemane and a verse from the Bible in needlepoint framed. But these were not his icons. His icons were in a box in a basement in San Francisco, stored with a friend who was probably already dead, because this is how the disease had decimated the gay community. And at that moment, I could sort of see the trajectory of his journey. And I remember feeling so awestruck by his body, because he was wearing just a diaper, and it looked like a loincloth. And his hair had grown long and wispy. His body was emaciated. He looked kind of Christ-like, the picture of suffering. And that night I came home and I wrote a scientific article describing this phenomenon of migration with two maps. One map showing where my patients lived all over America when they thought they got infected, and where they live now. And the paper got a lot of attention, a lot of citations. But even as the paper came out and got all this attention, I felt that the language of science didn't begin to capture the heartache of that journey, didn't begin to capture the tragic nature of the experience of the families, didn't begin to capture my own grief at living through this again and again. And so that was the moment that I became a writer, to try and tell that story. I thought that I would tell the story in fiction. I've always loved fiction. I've always loved fiction. I believe what Camus says, that, paraphrasing him, fiction is the great lie that tells the truth about how the world lives. For the young people in this room, there is no way you can experience everything in this world. But through the medium of novels, you can live several different lifetimes. In fact, the only instrument I know that can stop time in this world is a novel. You pick up a novel, if the novel's good, within 3 pages, you've suspended your disbelief, you've entered this world, 3 generations pass, wars, deaths, and then you finally reach the end, and it's just Tuesday. There is nothing else that can do that. So I wanted to tell that story as a novel, but for reasons I won't get into, there was much more interest in my telling that story as nonfiction. And so my first book was a nonfiction book, My Own Country. My second book, as it turned out, was also a nonfiction book, because you may not know this, nonfiction, I'm told, at least in America, and David would correct me here, nonfiction outsells fiction 10 to 1. True? He says true. So nonfiction outsells fiction 10 to 1. Why? Because if something really happened, you and I have an inherent interest in it that is much greater than anything you can make up. So if you have a true story and you can tell it well, it will sell, it'll get published. On the other hand, if you make up a story, you have to work 10 times as hard to get the reader to forget by page 2 that this is a made-up story. Get them to enter your world. I mean, you have a lot of freedom. You can make up, you can get into anybody's head, you can look into death and come back. But if you drop the reader's attention for one moment, the whole thing crashes. Nonfiction, on the other hand, the great advantage is the reader has the inherent interest, but you are confined to what happened. You can dramatize, you can rearrange, but you cannot take the liberty of just making stuff up and calling it nonfiction, because the contract with the reader is, this is true. That's why the reader is interested in it, and therefore you have to stick to those rules. I enjoyed writing nonfiction. I had to learn how to write nonfiction, but I really wanted to get back to writing the novel. And so I turned down offers from publishers to write more nonfiction and began this long journey to write my first novel, which was called Cutting for Stone. And I learned so much in the long years it took me to write that book. My first book took 4 years. The second book took 6 years. Cutting for Stone took 8 years. And Covenant of Water, the latest book, took 10 years. I'm not very good at math, but the trajectory is suggestive that I need to make some changes if I'm going to write any more books in this lifetime. But I've learned a lot in the process, and there are some thoughts I want to share with you. One of the most common questions I get asked, and I'll anticipate the question, people ask me, do you outline the whole story before you begin? And my answer is yes. I only wish I could stick to it. So I had, especially for my last book, I had the most elaborate outline, a whiteboard on my wall, completely covered with everything that was going to happen. And then I began to write, and the writing, at some point, a character would sort of determine that they were not going to do this thing that I had planned for them. The character had become so rich that it was clear they were not going to do this. There is an aphorism in writing, but it applies to life, which says that character is determined by decisions taken under pressure. You put someone under pressure, the decision they make is reflective of their character. So I would put the character under pressure, and they would balk at what I had planned for them. Where did that come from? It felt, call it the muse, call it God, call it my subconscious, but it felt something beyond my control, and it felt like what I had outlined was not true. And so I would quickly have to change direction, take a photograph of the whiteboard, start all over again. I did that so many times, and I think there are many writers who I suspect are like me, wish that they had an outline, wish they could plan it all out, but it doesn't work out. I've become a friend of John Irving's, who's been something of a mentor and a friend to me. John knows the first and last line of every chapter. He knows the first and last line of the book before he starts. John will say, he has said to me, Abraham, if you're just making this up as you go along, if you don't know what you're hiding under the table and when exactly you're going to bring it out, if you're making this up as you go along, then Abraham, you're not a writer, you're an ordinary liar. And I had the great pleasure of interviewing Michael Ondaatje on stage, someone else that I've become a friend to, and I brought up John's statement because they live in the same town in Toronto, and they are good friends. And Michael laughed when I told him what John said, and he says, John says that to me all the time. But he says, the thing is, and I know Michael's not that kind of writer. You can almost sense it when you read his books. They're more like poetry. They just sort of flow so beautifully. And Michael said to me, I think John is right and we are right in the sense that we arrive at the same place where we know the whole story, but we get there in different ways. And the way I get there is by meandering off in long detours that cost me 6, 7, 8 months, hundreds of pages, before I realize that's not the story, and then I pull back and go forward. I want to sort of wind down to leave enough time for us for questions. This little timer device says 15 minutes left. Is that about right? Okay. I want to wind down by coming back to something I said in the inauguration part, but I want to reiterate, even if you heard it, it's something that's been very helpful to me as a writer, and that is, writing is a collaborative venture. The writer provides words, the reader provides their imagination, and in middle space, this mental movie is created in the reader's mind, and it's unique to them. It's unique to them, which is why if you've ever gone to see the movie version of a book you loved, only to find they cast Antonio Banderas in the role of someone you pictured as, I don't know, Tom Cruise, then you know what I'm talking about. It's very much an individual thing. I sometimes get letters from people whose master's thesis is on the archetypal constructs and Jungian imagery in my work. And I read this and I think, oh my God, if only if I was that clever, you know? But they're not wrong. That is their interpretation of it. Everybody has their own interpretation. Another question I often get asked with both books is, so what happened afterwards? Well, I can't tell you that. It's up to you. I'm leaving it to you to imagine what happens next. So you may not know this, but there's so much that relies on you. And I think writers who provide too many words are in danger of boring you because you have nothing to do. You have no function. On the other hand, if you provide too few words, then the book is mysterious. I mean, I'm thinking of like James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake. Who the hell knows what that book is about? I have no idea. You know, and it may be very clever, but if this collaborative venture between writer and reader loses the reader, then all bets are off. But I want to come back to an anecdote that I have never had a chance to tell my brother, so I'll mention this. In Cutting for Stone, there is a scene where a little boy and his mother are on a plane. There's a woman called Hema on the plane, an obstetrician, and the plane is heading to Addis Ababa, but suddenly the pilot decides to divert it to Djibouti because he has a shipment of chat, which is kind of a stimulant drug that you chew that has to be delivered to a wedding. And so he fakes this emergency to be allowed to land there, and Hema, the obstetrician, pitches a fit. And in the process of the pilot, making like the plane is about to crash and needs an emergency landing, a little boy clutching a plane falls and breaks his leg in the plane, but he's clutching a toy plane. And this scene is based on my brother and I flying with my mother from Addis Ababa to Djibouti. And shortly after we took off, the pilot announced that we were being rerouted to Aden, or maybe we were going to Aden and being rerouted to Djibouti. Why? Because they were delivering bundles of chaat for a wedding somewhere. My mother pitched a fit. I mean, she just chewed them out and got them to put us up in a special place and refused to go back to Addis. And in my book, Cutting for Stone, Hema grabs the pilot's balls and effects a change in the direction of the plane. My mother didn't do that. But Reggie recognized the scene. My brother George recognized the scene. But he also remembered something that I did not, that I had been clutching a toy plane throughout that journey. And when he told me that, I was shocked because I had no conscious memory of it. And it brings me back to my fundamental thesis about writing. Writing is mysterious. It requires you to sit down. I don't get any inspiration walking by the lake or something. Your ass needs to be in the chair. 99% of the time, nothing happens, but you've got to keep trying. You've got to keep trying. And every now and then, the subconscious, the muse, whoever speaks to you, and those moments are pure gold. And you keep going through this torture in the hopes of having that breakthrough moment again and again. So I'll stop with that and take your questions. Thank you. So I think that they're passing questions down to the front. I prefer you pass questions to me because that does two things. My hearing is terrible, And it's no accident that covenant of water has a lot to do with hearing. But also when you pass papers up here, I can decide whether to read it, to answer it or not.
Dr. Verghese, I have the questions here with me.
Oh, you have some here? Okay.
Yes. Would you like me to read them?
May I take a look at the first?
Sure,
Okay.
please, if it's clear.
If writing is a form of self-discovery, what is reading? You know, I think reading is absolutely the way we process our world. I won't say more about that. I think I already spoke to how reading can direct your ship in trajectories that you would never have dreamed about. You know, I think stories are instructions for living, and we read in order to get those instructions. What did you discover when you read the books from different geographies concerning mainly your inner self? I'll come back to that, perhaps.
Okay.
This is a good question. Would you consider Covenant your magnum opus? I don't know. I mean, every book I've written, I've thought to myself, I'll never go through this again. You know, it's much easier to practice medicine than to go through this torture. You know, you have this mistress that turns on you and, you know, betrays you, and after a long while you are finally rid of them, and then, you know, with any luck, something good happens or not. And to go through that again. So, yeah, I mean, I think I give my all to every book. I don't hold anything back, which leaves me quite empty in terms of what's next. But I'm sure something will awaken soon. So, here's a good question. It says, writing is possible, publication is difficult. Would you think that writing fiction on whatever, social issues or anything for a private audience still may serve self-discovery? Is that good enough? I think that there are two parts to that question. I think we should all be keeping journals. I think it's amazing how when you sit and write at the end of the day, strictly for your own record of what happened, you understand what you're doing. I always say to myself that, you know, I'm writing to understand what I'm thinking. Seems like a paradox. You should be able to think what you're thinking. No, but you write and certain truths come out. But I would say that if you're going to write seriously and take pains with it, the goal is publication. And the question is, how much pain tolerance do you have? How many rejections can you take? Can you face the hard truth that perhaps it's not good enough? I get a lot of manuscripts sent to me, a lot of novels, especially from physicians. And, you know, they say everybody has a novel in them. Many of those novels should stay in them, you know. But what strikes me very often is people who have spent a lifetime doing something else decide they want to write. Well, would you go and write a chamber concerto or a symphony without ever having done that before or never having listened to music? So I think it's a precondition that you have to be a reader, you have to know what the bar is, what the standard is, and then you have to live up to that standard. I think there's a misconception that publishers are like putting up this giant wall, and what you need to do is find the right contact, the right person to lob the manuscript over the wall, and once it gets in there, it's magic. The opposite is true. Publishers are hungry for the next thing. When publishers saw Arundhati Roy's manuscript, The God of Small Things, in the slush pile, the lucky editor who saw it got on a plane within hours and flew to Delhi, I think is where she was, and signed her up. So the world is hungry for good stories. The obstacle is getting the story to the level that it gets their attention. It's very rare that huge talent is overlooked. It simply doesn't happen. Or the lack of a wrong agent, or the lack of the right agent, the right connection. This question is, do you think that medical school curricula should include fiction, non-fiction, movies? Yes, I think it should. In fact, in Texas for 7 years, I ran the Center for Medical Humanities. And our motto was to enhance the students' imagination for the suffering of the patient. You know, we were incredibly young when we went through medicine here in Madras. I don't think we had the maturity to fully imagine the suffering of the patients we were caring for. In America, they're older when they come to medicine, but they're still limited in their life experience. So we had a very strong curriculum and a very popular one. It's required in almost every school. There is no school that doesn't have a medical humanities curriculum, because if you want to learn about the end of life, you can read in a hospice book about end of life, or you can read The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy, and you will feel what it's like for a powerful person to suddenly get this news that their days are numbered. If you want to read about child abuse, you can read Nelson's textbook of pediatrics, or you can read Dorothy Allison's book, Bastard Out of Carolina, or see the movie, and you will feel in your gut what child abuse looks like and what the aftermath of that is for the child. So I'm a big believer that medical humanities movies, plays, we always show Wit, the wonderful play Wit, or the movie version Wit, W-I-T. Really a beautiful end of life, acted by, I'm blanking on the very famous British actress who does that. Anyway, if you don't know it, please see that wonderful movie. Emma Thompson, thank you. So yeah, I believe medical humanities has a role. I do think that if they tried to teach it at MMC when we were there, very much like our medical students, we would have been a bit cynical, especially because there's so much other information we have to memorize. So when we taught it at Texas, the first question the medical students would ask us, is this going to be on the examination? And I would say, hell yes. And then they studied it. And I had no illusions. They were not always excited by it. But I've met people 20 years later who say, you know, I did your humanities course, I didn't think much about it, but many years later, this particular story or this particular thing spoke to me again. Because people have to have a certain maturity to really get it, and sometimes they're not quite ready for it. I'm impressed. There's a whole stack of questions here. A bunch of writers in this room. Thank you for the many hours of pleasurable reading. Reading Covenant of Water, I did feel the portrait of child marriage was very idealized. Any comment would be welcome, especially since this practice still exists in parts of India. I think that's a fair comment. You should know that it was very daring for me to begin the Covenant of Water with a 12-year-old bride on her wedding day to a Western audience, which is who, you know, I'm writing in English. The bulk of my audience is Western or English readers. And yeah, they can get really turned off to open a book, and that's where it starts. But I really wanted to play against the grain and try and set up this 12-year-old marrying an older widower and completely challenge the reader's expectations of what was going to happen. And I wanted to do that because it is the true story of my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was married at 10, actually, to a widower who had 2 children already. And his sister lived in the house, and she was like a mother to our great-grandmother, who we never met. And when she came of age, is the only time the marriage was, you know, officially a marriage. And she went on to bear him several children, and by all accounts, they had a wonderful marriage. She was a very strong woman. He obviously died before her, but I was just playing against the grain. I guess I could have written a story that was about a child marriage that was miserable and went nowhere, but I'm not sure that would have been a very compelling tale to tell. I think there's a lot of stories like that we're all aware of. But that's a fair question.